Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Oh My Career Goodness podcast. I'm your host, Hamza Islam. My guest this week is Mussab Ali, who in 2017 was elected to the Jersey City Board of Education, making him one of the youngest elected Muslim officials in North America or in the United States. I'm sorry. Now he is the student body president at Harvard Law School and also the founder of the Ali Leadership Institute, whose mission is to empower the next generation of civic leaders across the country. Musab's journey has been full of obstacles, from discrimination to doubts because of his age, and also being diagnosed with stage 4 non-Hodgkins lymphoma. And no matter what has come his way, he has always found a way to overcome those obstacles, and there's nothing that is going to stop him. I truly respect his work ethic and his mentality. And yeah, it's going to be hard. There's always going to be doubt, but also self-doubt, like, am I even good enough? But Musab constantly has proven time and time again that nothing is going to stop him. So here's my conversation with Mussab Ali. Hope you guys enjoy it. And I also want to add, this feels like I'm talking to Miss Marvel because of how similar their stories are. But I really hope you guys enjoy this conversation. Mussab Ali, welcome to the Oh My Career Goodness podcast.
Hamza, thank you for having me.
I'm so excited for for this interview, and I've been waiting for this interview for such a long time because I set up a little challenge before you came on, which is I hope that whoever's listening to this podcast, or even you including, I hope that by the end of this episode, all of us will come to the conclusion that you and Miss Marvel have a lot in common. I really do. When I was getting ready for this interview, I was like, wow, you and Miss Marvel have so much in common. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that's just my little prediction.
Yeah, I mean, the show is actually based on my high school. It's a Pakistani girl who goes to Coles Academic. My high school used to literally be called Academic. It's on Cole Street, right? So like literally that's the high school. She's from Jersey City, right? And I think a lot of the struggles she faces, I think a lot of young people growing up in America kind of face when they grow up in an immigrant household. So I think there's lots of connections, but I will say I don't have any superpowers, unlike her, so kind of missed out there.
No, you know what? I think, well, here's the thing. You may not have superpowers, but I do think that you are an amazing human being, and you have had an amazing journey to where you are today. But I want to start from the beginning because you were born in Pakistan and you moved to the United States. And for many people, I can't relate to you because I was born in the United States, but I did grow up with immigrant parents. And there's always this thought or this notion that people come to the United States in search of a better life. Now, I think when you moved to the United States, you were relatively young, but what do you remember at the time, what that moment was for you? Or looking back, what was that moment like for you to come to the United States?
Yeah, so I was born in Pakistan in 1997, and we moved to America September of 2000. And I think a lot of it is like, this pursuit of a better life, right? In pursuit of better educational opportunities for your kids. I mean, my parents were fairly well established in Pakistan. My mom like taught physics at a university. My dad used to work for like the national power utilities company. And when they came here, I mean, my dad started working off at 7-Eleven. My mom was, had a hard time even just becoming a preschool teacher. So they really started back from nothing. And what I remember is like it was really tough, right? I think the immigrant experience is always really tough. I remember, it was my family and my aunt's family. We used to live together in one house, and so there was maybe, I want to say, 10 or 11 of us in a 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom apartment. And so I just remember, like, there is that like universal immigrant struggle, right? Where you're adapting to a new environment, adapting to a new culture. And I mean, big shout out to my parents. I mean, I can't imagine, in my 30s, like kind of picking up my whole life and moving somewhere where I barely knew anyone, and starting a brand new life. But that's what they were able to do. So I'm always very appreciative of the sacrifices that they've made.
Yeah, and growing up in a different culture, especially for Pakistan, there are a lot of Muslims in Pakistan, and then now you're moving into the United States where there is still a relatively large Muslim population, but you're still in the minority. and it's very hard to adjust to that. And kind of like why I talked about like how you and Miss Marvel have so much in common. It's that, you're growing up in an environment that's different from you, and it's very easy to not fit in. It's very easy to go, well, do I have to give up something? Do I have to give up my identity in order to be accepted by this new environment? Growing up, how big of a struggle was that for you, and how are you able to still stay true to yourself?
Yeah. So, I mean, you say America has like a relatively large Muslim population, but like, it's 1% of Americans are Muslim, right? So, like, that's a very, very, very tiny number. I think in New Jersey, I think we have the highest density of Muslims, maybe about 3% of people in New Jersey are Muslim. But, I consider myself a practicing Muslim, and I think there definitely was a lot of trade-offs in sort of making those decisions, right? I think I distinctly remember like 9/11 happening. I mean, I remember I literally, in Jersey City, we're right across the river from New York City. So you have like the view of downtown Manhattan, like literally from your window. And on 9/11, like I happened to be staying home. I think my brother and I, we were supposed to go for vaccines that day. And I remember looking out of my window and seeing the second plane hit. And I think for me, like at that time, I didn't really recognize like what that would mean for me growing up. But growing up in the shadow of the Twin Towers, like you kind of grow up with this expectation that you're not a part of society, that your community is something that's dangerous, is something that's scary. And I think there were a lot of moments in which my identity like really played a big role in terms of how I saw myself. I remember, going on a like a family walk on the park in Jersey City. And I remember this like group of teenagers who like threw rocks at my mom because she wore the hijab. And I remember, I mean, my mom was also a very fierce woman. I remember her like taking her shoes off and like trying to chase these kids. But you know, it was like in the moment she kind of did that, but then afterward, like I remember her sort of crying about it. And I was so young that there was really nothing I could do, right? And I remember sort of thinking about like the words that they said and how they asked her to go back to her country. And I thought that was all like, a lot of that I think was very formative in my experience growing up, where, you know, it felt like I was a little bit different. It felt like I was a little bit of an outcast, especially within society. But I will say the one thing I really have loved about Jersey City and growing up there, and part of the reason I think it's the greatest city in the world is that within the school system, I didn't have to feel like a minority. We're the most diverse city in America. And so what that meant actually is like within the schools, everybody was different, right? Like everyone came from a different background. About 43% of the residents are foreign born, which means like almost a majority of the people there are not born in America, right? Like they are immigrants. We're generally a first generation immigrant town. And so you have all these people who are coming in from different backgrounds and different walks of life. And sure, there were a lot of preconceived notions about who people are and what they represented, but for the most part, I really felt like I grew up in a community, at least within the school system, where I felt like I could be who I was and be authentic to my true self and not feel like because of the God that I worship or the way that I looked, that I was going to be treated differently or that my words meant less.
You brought up an interesting thing, which is I guess your experience being discriminated against, and how there were teenagers that threw rocks at your mom. And just to provide a little historical perspective, there were a lot of hate crimes against Muslims, especially after 9/11. And there was always this notion of go back to where you came from because we don't want people like you. And you are obviously, I guess, in a way, lucky that you got to grow up in a community where people embraced you and never questioned who you were or in terms of from an identity perspective. But was there ever a time where you thought maybe it's better that we do go back, because obviously safety is the most number one thing for you and your family, and given that there's so much, like, there is hate crimes happening either to you or people that you know, was there ever a thought of like maybe we should go back because it's unsafe to live here?
So again, I think the where the embracement kind of happened was within the school system. And I think if we like fast forward a little bit to 2016 when I first ran my first campaign, I mean, I remember being bombarded with Islamophobia, right? And I think it was kind of shocking to me actually in a sense because, you know, you go through the school system and you kind of feel like, oh, like this is what the city represents, like this is what who the city is. And then you graduate and you start to interact with the city in a different light, and especially in a political light. And I remember, my parents are both very opposed to me running. I mean, they were not They didn't think it was a good idea. My community had generally kind of like kept their head down and kind of been like, listen, we're going to stay out of the limelight. We're not going to get involved. Um, and so for me, it was always like, I wanted to be that generational shift in how we approached being involved in our community. But I remember people asking me, like, are you going to force Sharia law into our schools? Are you going to force my daughter to wear hijab? I remember, I think it was maybe during our first campaign, like a window of my car like had been like shattered because like someone had thrown a rock essentially at the window of my car, and we reported to the cops, and like nothing ever happened. But there were all these sorts of things that I think introduced me to a different kind of world. And I think part of that also was because of what was happening at the presidential election at that time, right? I mean, Donald Trump's candidacy, I think, like really emboldened a lot of people to say, like, yeah, it's okay to treat people a certain way because of where they came from. And it trickles down, right? Like even in the little bubble we created in Jersey City that was so diverse, like people felt emboldened to kind of say hateful things and use racial slurs and kind of cast people away as outsiders and foreigners.
You ran for Jersey City Board of Education, and I know this took two attempts, but ultimately, I think you hold the record for youngest council member for Jersey City. But the first time you ran, I know when you first started, I think this was after the 2016 presidential elections. You obviously have really good ideas for how to improve education in Jersey City, but there's always this doubt of like, well, you're too young, or you're Muslim, or you can't do it because of whatever sort of trait. And ultimately, it's on you to keep going. But was there also, how often did you have to battle self-doubt? Because you know what you're worth, but when you're hearing these things that people are saying about you, it's very easy to think like maybe this is true. So how were you able to battle that internal battle?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember. So I ran in 2019. Sorry, I ran in 2016 when I was 19 years old, and we lost that election. Um, and that election, like losing that election, I think really hurt because I think that sort of reinforced what a lot of people had said to us, which was like, you're too young. It's not your turn. You're not ready yet. And then when the voters like don't vote for you, you kind of start to believe that, right? Like, hey, like I really am not ready for this position. And I think again, part of the reason I ran in 2017 again, like the only reason I ran was I think meeting the moment, right? I remember, Trump gets elected, one of his first policies is the Muslim ban. And, when it's during the campaign and you hear the rhetoric, I mean, there's lots of politicians who put some crazy rhetoric and then they get in office and they kind of moderate their views. But I remember thinking to myself, like, this is not normal, right? This is not something that feels like everything else that's sort of happening. Um, and so 2017, when I get elected, I remember one of my first interactions with the district is, we have a central office. It's like 8 floors. And so you have to like check in, like when you go in to the security guard. And so I walk in the building, you got to sign in. And as I'm signing in, security guard looks at me and is like, oh, are you the new high school intern? And I remember just thinking to myself, like, what a weird position I was in because externally they looked at me and they perceived me as this like really young person. And yet I had been given this like really large responsibility where like effectively, if you look at the chain of command, I mean, like the school district sits on the top, right? Like the superintendent directly reports to the board. And so someone who's an employee of the district is like reporting up all the way to the chain, all the way to the top. And they're perceiving me as like a kid from high school. And so I think there were a lot of moments where I had a little bit of insecurity about who I was and like my background. And I think to sort of modulate that, the thing that I did is I tried to be the best, like most knowledgeable person in the room in terms of like doing all the readings, like figuring out as much background research as I could do. But I think for a long time that doesn't go away, right? Like I think part of it is just persevering through it, right? And just kind of like faking it till you make it. And I think eventually I got to the point where I had earned the respect of my colleagues. But for a long time, like I definitely felt like I was out of place. I had never seen someone who looked like me, someone my age in these positions. And so I didn't really have people that I could go to and say, like, hey, how do I do this job? Right? Like what are the things that I need to do for people to take me seriously?
You lost the first time, but you end up winning the second time. And so I would love to know what you were able, like how you're able to motivate yourself. Because when you lose an election like this, it's very easy to feel discouraged. It's easy to feel like, you should give up in the moment. So what allowed you to motivate yourself to try it again? And secondly, what was that moment like for you to finally win that election?
Yeah, I think a big part of the motivation, again, sort of came from meeting the moment, right? Like I don't think it was as much about like who I was as much as like what was happening and why I felt like my story was so important to share, right? I think, having someone in office who was talking about my city, having people who I felt like weren't representing my views, um, and the views of our generation, right? Like I felt like it was so important to have young people have a seat at the table. And so I felt very strongly that we needed to do that. And I got very lucky because in 2017, there was so traditionally on the school board, there's three people who run for 3-year terms. And so there's a 9-member board. But someone had resigned in 2017. And so there was a 1-year seat that was open, as well as the three-year seats. And so I said to myself, well, if Jersey City is ever going to elect a 20-year-old Muslim, it's probably going to be for this 1-year seat. Like, because worst case scenario, they hate me, they think I'm a foreigner, they think I suck at the job. Well, you could just vote me out next year or decide not to run for re-election. But it was like all the stars kind of aligned in a way that like made this make sense for me. And so like all those things lined up, I decided to run again. And I had only one opponent actually that year. And so it was a one-on-one election. It very much was like me versus him, like having to do debates where it was like constantly facing off against one other person. And I was fortunate that the voters like very narrowly by narrow margin elected me. So the final vote count was 9,388 to 9,320. That's 68 votes. So if 40 people had just went the other way, I mean, I probably wouldn't even be sitting here with you, right? Like I think it dramatically changed the trajectory of my life.
Now, what's one of the most interesting things about life is that we don't know the outcome until that outcome happens. And so we can now sit here and say, like, yeah, you used to run or you ran you were a part of the Jersey City Board of Education. But let's say you lost that second event or you lost that second time. How much would life look differently for yourself?
I think I'd probably be in medical school. I think I would probably be probably my second or third year of med school. I think there's lots of opportunity I would have had, lots of really interesting people I would have never got a chance to meet. I mean, I just think like I don't think we can underscore like how much of an impact certain events have in our life. And I think in this one in particular, right? Like I went from someone and I think even for my community, like we went from a community that was like never involved in politics, like never really engaged, to now being like a real force in the city, right? I mean, in in 2016, if you had told me that I would be, at Harvard Law School and being considered as a front runner for mayor of Jersey City, I would have thought you were insane. And but you look at the 7-year pathway of like how things have happened, and a lot of it, right, is like, I think a blessing from God to like be able to get me to where I am today. But I don't think you can even predict some of this stuff. I couldn't have written a book that would have like gotten me to the places where I am today.
Now, I want to talk about what I want to talk about the reality because you did end up winning and you became the youngest member or youngest elected member for Jersey City. Oh, for Jersey City School Board. Thank you. And under your leadership, you did many things. You established a $17 minimum wage. You raised teachers' minimum salary. You eliminated student lunch debt. And so these are just one of many things that you have done under your leadership. And the interesting thing about you is that it's not just that you're representing yourself, but you're representing South Asians. You're representing Muslims. You're representing young people. Was there when you're going through this, was there a part of you that was like you're trying to prove to yourself, or was it more of, look, I'm one of many people who have a really good idea, and given that I may look different from other people, that this is more. So was it more like about you, or like the fact that you are one of many people who are trying to have a seat in the table, and hopefully let people know that you're here to make your community a better place?
Yeah, I think it's a combination, right? So I think I definitely felt as though our community was underrepresented. And I think I also was very lucky in terms of feeling like I was a credible messenger, right? So I went through the public school system myself. I consider myself a success story within the public schools, right? I'd gone to like pretty much like the pipeline of how you do the best schools in Jersey City. I'd gotten a full scholarship to go off to college. And so I felt like I had been able to really do schools right. But at the same time, I saw so many people who like fell through the cracks. I saw so many people in our community that didn't know how to navigate the system. And again, I was very lucky, right? Like my mom was a teacher, right? And so navigating the school system, at least K to 12, kind of like made sense to me. Like I had someone who I could rely on, someone who I could talk to. But I think a lot of people didn't have that. And so for me, it was like combining my background and sort of the experiences I had, but also understanding that like I represented something more than myself. And I think, especially during the campaign, one of the things that I really emphasize to people is like, I know I have all these certain backgrounds and they do inform the decisions that I make. But I also recognize like I'm not just representing young people. I'm not just representing South Asians, right? Like I represent everyone in my city. And so it was very important for me to do outreach to every single community, even communities that like were not supportive of me, people that probably did not agree with most of my views. I still represented them. And so it was important for me to have a seat at the table in their conversations, to understand how they thought about their views, to try to express my views and explain why I voted certain ways or why I was moving forward certain agenda items. And so all these sorts of things I think were important for me in the electoral process.
One of the darkest moments in your life was when you were diagnosed with stage 4 Hodgkins lymphoma. Hopefully I pronounced that right. And it's one of the scariest things because when people are diagnosed with these kinds of things, it's you're now thinking about, okay, what, like you're in the scary moment of what's going to happen to me. And for you, I would love to know, because obviously you were still a member of the board while going through this. How did this diagnosis change your perspective of life going forward?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting story. I'll tell the story like just last week. So literally last week was my birthday, right?
Happy late birthday.
And so 2 years ago, on February 26th, 2021, I checked into the hospital. And this is for my first chemotherapy treatment, right? And I remember the nurse kind of like looking at my wristband and like, my birthday was the next day. So she was like, happy birthday. And I remember like, I just had this like look of like, what does she mean? Happy birthday, right? Like, did I really feel like it was a happy birthday, right? I mean, I'm like, I was turning 24, but at the same time, like you said, right? I just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Um, and I remember the next day, right? Like this is my first chemotherapy treatment. And obviously chemo is like tough on everyone. I'm not gonna get into the details, but like, like chemotherapy is not fun. Just put it like that. So the next day I'm kind of like in my bed, like zombie mode, like cannot move. And I'm getting all these messages that are saying happy birthday, right? Like, there's so many people at this point who did not know that I had this diagnosis. At this point, it had been very private. And I remember thinking about this, like from the outside looking in, when people thought about my life and where I was in the last year since my last birthday, I had graduated with my master's degree from Schwarzman College in China. I had enrolled at Harvard Law School. I had just been elected the president of the Board of Education. So that January, they actually ran a headline on NJ.com that said, elected BOE president at 23, Mussab Ali continues to make history in Jersey City. And so from the outside looking in, I mean, people just thought I was so successful, right? Like so many congratulations messages, like people who hadn't talked to me in a year were like, wow, like look at the year that you've accomplished. And again, for me, I'm sort of laying in bed, like thinking about how ironic it is because I literally have a cancer diagnosis. I'm like, there's like uncertainty about like what's going to happen in my life. And so I think so many people just like did not have that perspective about what was going on. And I think part of the reason also, to be very frank, like part of the reason we didn't make this public was because of everything that was happening on the school board, right? So my elected duties, I think, also really influenced like what was going on. That January, as I had taken over, part of my responsibilities, like part of my ethos in that year was reopening the school system, right? So that meant negotiating with teachers unions, negotiating with the governor, negotiating with the mayor's office. The governor had also just cut somewhere between 70, I think it was like $75 million from our budget. So we had an $814 million budget. He had cut $75 million. And so I was like thinking through ways of like filling this massive, massive hole that we were going to face. And so I have all these things happening politically. And politically, you kind of have to, I mean, again, like when we go back to my earlier answer, like how did I represent myself as a young person, right? I showed myself as someone with no vulnerabilities. I showed myself as someone with no chinks in my armor. I was someone who like always got the things done, like was always ready, was always competent, like never had any sort of failures that were happening. And so for the first time in my life, now I'm facing something that's like outside of my control. And I've just been elected by my colleagues in this like really, really important position at a really, really important time in our history. And so I didn't necessarily know like when to share the news, how to share the news, like what was going on. And so the next month we make this public. And I'll be honest, part of the reason was because like my hair was falling out, right? So I like, and it's not just the hair on your head. I mean, like my beard fell out, my eyebrows, my eyelashes, right? Like no hair left on my body. And so we make this public, we make the diagnosis public. And I think for me, I think the whole cancer journey was a really, really interesting sort of like stream of emotions. And I'm still reflecting, I think still like processing a lot of the stuff that I went through at the time. But initially, I remember when I first got this diagnosis, I was like super, super upset, right? Like, I mean, like obviously like frustrated, right? Like, I mean, I thought to myself, like, look, like my life has been dedicated to public service, right? Like ever since 19, I've been trying to improve my community. I've been trying to work for the betterment of the people in my city and in my community. And so how is it fair that someone like me is getting a cancer diagnosis? I mean, I didn't drink, I didn't smoke. Um, I like, was exercising every day, like ate pretty healthy. And so I thought all of that was like really frustrating. But I'll be honest with you, like what was really nice for me is in those moments you kind of get to ask yourself, right? Like, who am I? Like, what am I doing? Like, if like what do I want out of my life? And I got to answer those questions and look myself in the mirror. And I actually was very happy with who I was and what I was doing, which is why I continued, right? I continued to be in public office because I was like, I enjoy serving others. I enjoy like solving people's problems. And so for me, I actually, after the first couple of minutes of being frustrated, I was actually kind of okay with it, right? I was like, look, like if God has more time for me, he's going to give me more time. But if God's happy with the work that I'm doing, then like I'm not upset about it. And so after the first couple of moments, I think I had a lot of like peace and tranquility in my heart going forward in that process. But I think obviously like a lot of the way that shapes you is like it also just gives you a perspective on time, right? Like when people now ask me like, what is your long-term vision? I mean, like, what does long term mean anymore, right? Like, I think it just completely changes the way you think about how you live every day, how you kind of think about the moments that you have, and who you want to spend them with, and what you want to be doing in them.
Yeah, no, and one of the scariest things, and I'm glad you were able to show a bit of vulnerability in you, is the fact that, we see all the successes that you are having and the history that you're making, but you're also going through an internal battle, and it really helps you realize that, life is very confusing. And we have to be careful with, yes, people are doing great things, but there's always something that people are going through and you just never know about it. So I thank you for being able to share that. Now, you are the student body president at Harvard Law School, but before we talk about that, unfortunately, the diagnosis did force you to, at some point, resign from your position as president of the Jersey City Board of Education. Now, I know you're in a much better place, but is there still part of you that still wishes that you could still be part of that process now, or do you feel like you kind of moved on from that?
Yeah, so I didn't have to resign. I just didn't run for reelection. So
Oh,
actually,
okay.
the timing worked out really like an interesting way, right? So in 2018, I had been reelected, and this time for a 3-year term. And so that meant that 3-year term was going to end December of 2021. So if I want to run for reelection, it would have been November of 2021. And so, January, February, like kind of like, get this diagnosis, February, like the treatment until August. And so petitions were due for reelection in July. And so at the time, I was still going through chemotherapy treatment. And what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to risk being on the ballot and having cancer because at this point we didn't know if I was going to beat it or not. We were just still going through the treatment. We didn't have like the final scans or anything like that. Um, and so I was always very conscientious. I think when I was on the school board about legacy, like I think legacy means a lot to me. And so part of the reason I never wanted to resign is I never wanted another young person to sort of face those questions, right? I never wanted someone to be like, oh, we elected Mussab when he was 20 and young people, like, they can't stay and they can't commit to these positions. And more likely than not, nobody probably would have faulted me for leaving with everything that was going on. But I was very conscientious. Like, I didn't want other young people to be questioned about that sort of thing. And I was very fortunate. I had a young person who had been working with me while I was on the school board, who we actually got elected. I think he was 22 years old when he was elected, and so he got elected into the school board, sort of like in my stead. Like, as I left the public office, like, we got him elected that November. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, like, I still kind of feel very connected to what's happening on the school district, right? Like, I still advise members who are on the board. I still have people who like reach out to me. Um, Sometimes I do wish I was more involved because I think I can see the long-term problems that the district is facing, and I have an understanding of all the different issues that are there. But I think part of me also recognizes, like, it's time for me to move on and to work on different issues, because I think the school system, like, there's lots of other things that still need to happen, and there's other people who can kind of carry that responsibility.
You are now a student body president at one of probably the country's best law schools, arguably probably in the world. And I know that's a huge honor that you take, but I do want to ask what the transition has been like from being president of Jersey City Board of Education to now student body president at Harvard Law School. Has it been a difficult transition, or do you feel like some of the things that you had previously still connect with you with your new role?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that sort of uh, translate over to like school politics
Yeah.
in a different way. Um, I mean, I've like really enjoyed this role in the sense that, when I talk to leadership in my school now, like at this law school, when I talk to the dean's office, or I talk to dean of admissions or dean of students, I feel like I understand their perspective a lot more than I think the average student will, because I kind of sat in their chairs, right? Like, I sat in the chair of administration. I understand, like, communication. I understand, like, the different things that they're understanding. But I also think, like, we were really able to build capacity as a school, as a student body, because of all the experiences that I had. Like, I understand how to, improve lines of communication. Like, I understood how to build capacity. I understood how to sort of like build relationships with different student organizations. And I gotta say, I mean, none of that kind of gets done on my own, right? Like, I have a very, very powerful team that works with me. My co-president is incredible. I mean, she is like, I mean, honestly, the real reason that the student government kind of runs. But I think there are a lot of things that translate over. I think what's interesting to me is I've always sort of thought of the position in Jersey City as like much more impressive, in the sense of, like, it really felt like real work every day, right? Like, you were really dealing with problems. But what strikes me is, like, especially students at Harvard, and I think even at the undergraduate college, to them the most impressive thing about me is student body president at Harvard Law School. And I think it's just perspective, right? I think, like, people believe, like, if you're someone who can lead other leaders, then, like, you're going to be able to go out in the world and, like, do sort of like all these really incredible things. But to me, I've always kind of like had a different perspective on that, where I don't think we're going to be judged by how we interact with, like, wealthy and powerful people. And I mean, in fairness, like, everyone at Harvard Law School is going to be someone who's going to be pretty powerful in the world. I think we're judged more by how we interact with everyday people. How do we interact with poor people? How do we interact with those who are on the fringes of society, the people who are excluded? Because I think those people and your interactions with them is something you have to be much more intentional about, right? I mean, like, when you're talking to someone from Harvard Law, like, there's an understanding that they're going to be important, they're going to be powerful, or they might be, right? I mean, a lot of my classmates come from very wealthy backgrounds, powerful families, but like, but I think, again, it's easy to be in those positions and to be like, oh, like, I have to treat people really well because who knows? But I think it's harder when you're like in a position where they're strangers who are like down on their luck and like not doing super well. And how do you treat those people? And I think that's why, for me, like, the Jersey City stuff has always like felt like more important to me than the work at Harvard Law School. But like, it's been a fun job. I think my term's going to end at the like almost the end of this month, so we're almost done with that position.
You've been very passionate about your community, and you always care about giving back in however way you can. And you kind of touched on about how, even though you are someone from Harvard Law School, that the most important thing to you is how do you talk to people who are on the fringes of society, who are less fortunate. And something that I really found interesting about you is that you co-founded an organization or an institute called the Ali Leadership Institute. You want to empower the next generation of civic leaders. That's one of the most important things to you. I'd love to know how that first started for you and what it's like to see people who want to be in the same position as you, because you've had a journey to where you are today, and I know you're going to do better things in the future. But what is it like seeing people who want to be that, I guess, next Mussab Ali, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't think people need to aspire to be the next me. I think like everyone has their own individual journey. But so the Ali Leadership Institute, like the idea of that, the genesis of that came about in 2018. So right after I'd been elected, I sort of looked around and I realized that there were very few young people who were involved. And I also realized that young people, we don't actually have an understanding of how powerful our voices really are and our ability to organize. So this is happening around the same time. There's lots of other youth movements happening around the country. But think about like March for Our Lives. Um, and so I decided to start a program to train young people to be more involved in their communities and to find a way to give back immediately, right? Instead of waiting for, one day I'll be rich and wealthy and then I sort of give back. Um, and so that really started like me and my co-founder, we worked together, sort of like launch this program, start to get young people involved. And it's really grown to be this thing where I feel like we've built a very strong community of people who are very civic minded. I mean, just yesterday, actually, I was down at Princeton University, and one of our fellows had been admitted there. And he was talking to me about how he changed his major from a bachelor's of science in computer science to a bachelor of arts. And he said part of the reason he wanted to do that was he wanted to have some sort of public service or civic aspect even in his coursework, right? He was very conscious of the fact that he wanted to give back to his community, that he wanted to be someone who like provided more value to the world than just being someone who's like some sort of software engineer at a big tech company. And so I feel like we've really tried to change the perspective of young people and have them understand that, you can be someone who changes the world even at a very young age. And again, I've just been very lucky, right? I've been very fortunate with the opportunities that I've been given where I've been able to make some of that impact at a very young age. But I think a lot of people are also making that sort of difference, but sometimes it's just not highlighted or spotlighted the same way.
Before I let you go, my last question is, if you went back in a time machine and you met yourself, whether it's those moments of self-doubt or those moments where you were being discriminated against because of who you are, and as a Muslim, given that you are in a better position, and I know you are going to continue to find ways to make the world a better place, what would you say to that younger version of Musab?
It's a tough question. I think for the most part, I think I just say, I think I'd remind myself like my life motto, right? So like, I don't know when I picked this up. I mean, I gotta say it's been with me for a couple of years, but um, I definitely didn't have it. I think when I started out, and it's this quote, and it's this is one of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he says, no amount of guilt can change the past, and no amount of worrying can change the future. And I think like that's been something that has like really provided me with a lot of peace when I think about like my journey and sort of like, dwelling on things and thinking about the future. Because I mean, at the end of the day, like you can only control what you can control, right? And so feeling guilty about decisions that have already happened or like stressing out about stuff that will happen, like is not a productive way to spend your time. Like stressing out about something doesn't do anything about it. Like you actually have to be very like conscientious about what are you doing towards your goals, what are you doing towards the things that you want to change. And so I think I'd probably like adapt that motto a lot earlier in my life, to the extent possible.
You mentioned in the beginning that you said that you don't have superpowers compared to Miss Marvel, but I obviously feel that at the end, I feel like based on our conversations, you are definitely a superhero to many people. So, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I know you are extremely busy with Harvard Law School, so good luck with that. But seriously, thank you so much for continuing to be an inspiration. And I can't wait to see what are some things, or I can't wait to see all the exciting things happening in the future.
Thanks, Hamza. Thank you for having me.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you saw, feel free to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at the OMCG Podcast. I appreciate the support I've been receiving the past few months. Please continue to do that. And I can't wait to see you guys in the next episode.